Okay, hi everyone. Thank you for being here for this panel, which I'm sure many of you must be hungry because it's that time of the day. If I could actually just request the people standing outside the author's lounge to go in or move so that we don't have to deal with additional noise, that would be very nice. But they're not listening to me, so it's okay. All right, it's fine. Yeah. Okay, so welcome, and this is a panel which is supposed to be an adda. So we are just going to be talking to each other informally, although we are sitting in a straight line, which you don't often do in an adda, but that is what makes it unusual. And we're going to try and get into the heads of translators. So all of us on the stage are translators, and between us, we have 4 different languages. So Vishesh over there has translates from Rajasthani and has built an archive, or is building an archive, of the amazing work of a rather wonderful writer called Vijay Deta, who wrote stunning short stories, which actually, Vishesh, many feminists have appropriated, especially Bija Tija and the one that was made into a film, Duvidha, yes. So that's his work. Aruna Chakravarti is a writer and a translator from Bengali, and she has done an amazing amount of work translating Aruna, most recently Tagore, right?
No, Tagore was my first translation.
Was your first translation, okay. And then Arshia Sattar here, who lives in Bangalore and translates from Sanskrit, and has translated the Ramayana in an extremely accessible and unput-downable English. And I have read it many times over at different stages in my life. I'm not really a translator. I'm kind of an interloper. I've only translated one book from Hindi to English, and I'm now trying to translate another one from Hindi, and I'm stuck at page 1. This morning I made a little headway in 2 paragraphs, so I feel, okay, maybe I'm starting. But I'm a publisher, and I would talk about translation from a publisher's perspective. So we are going to start. I'm going to start by asking everybody a question, which is really, why do you translate? What does it mean to you? How did you come to translation? What was the first book you worked on? What were the challenges? So in brief, if you can talk about that as an introduction. And Aruna, why don't we start with you?
Thank you, Urvashi. Yeah, now translation came to me in a very strange kind of a way, and it really paved the way. It began the way for my entire career. It all happened very strangely, you know. I was at a party, at a dinner party, and there was a musical component.
Dinner parties is where it starts.
Yeah. So, and there was a music component, like with the dinner. And some people were singing Rabindra Sangeet. Now, I have learned Rabindra Sangeet, so I was asked to join. So I joined. Now, the first song we were singing was a song called Amar Mukti Aloe Aloe. I think many of you may have heard the song. And suddenly somebody arose in the audience and said, can somebody translate this song? Because he was a non-Bengali. And my sister just turned to me and said, why don't you do it? I was the English teacher, so they thought I could do anything. And I was really, you know, totally flummoxed, because my Bengali wasn't all that good at that time. And I have had no structured education in Bengali. And I'm also basically a very, very diffident person. But I don't know what happened, Urvashi. I said, okay. And I still look back and I wonder why I said okay. And then the whole thing, you know, the first line is Amar Mukti Aloe Aloe Ei Akashe. Now, Mukti, the first word that comes to you when you think in English is freedom. And I almost uttered the words, you know, you know, I just said that freedom, whatever. I've started a sentence with freedom. But someone just stopped me. And what happened was, the whole song, the message of the whole song kind of flashed before my eyes. And I realized that he didn't mean freedom. in the sense that we mean freedom. Because freedom has certain connotations, you know, social connotations, domestic, political, and Rabindranath didn't mean any of these things. In fact, what he was looking for was not freedom from self, from any form of oppression, but freedom from self. He was looking for a kind of affinity with the entire created world. And so I translated it as, I am released into the light in the sky. I am merged with each fragment of grass, with each fragment of dust, with every blade of grass. And then suddenly I thought, array, this is wonderful, I can do it. And somehow it was a success. And I got my first commission, in fact, at that very dinner party. There was a publisher there. And he said, I'm very impressed with your translation, so why don't you do a book for us? So that is how it started.
That's how and some of the challenges that you faced over the years?
Well, challenges were many. You know, the main thing about doing, Tagore was my first attempt. Then, of course, I did Sunil Gangopadhyay, many of his books. I did many of the contemporary Bengali authors. I did Srikanto from Sharad Chandra. The challenges, basically, you know, it's not exactly. It's the main challenge is getting from one culture into another culture, you know. And I realized one thing also when I was translating Amar Mukti Aloyale, is that translation is not about translating words. It's about translating the spirit, and not only the spirit of the work, but also the tone, the tonal quality of the author. For instance, if I translate Rabindranath, if I give him the kind of voice that Sunil Gangopadhyay speaks in, it's wrong, it's bad translation. So what really is needed is, you know, reading whatever you're translating over and over again till you imbibe it, it becomes part of yourself, and then you simply transcreate it. You know, you don't really, I don't even call it translation. So, I mean, there were many challenges, like when I was doing Sunil Gangopadhyay, the kind of, particularly in dialogue, you know, the kind of language they speak. They spoke a very pithy, very, you know, raunchy North Bengali dialect, which was very difficult to bring into English. And in fact, I tried many dialects, you know. I thought maybe Cockney, maybe, you know, the way the blacks used to speak when they were, you know, plantation blacks, then maybe the Scottish, but nothing seemed to work. And finally, I thought I'll just write simple King's English, but I'll put in doses and lots of Bengali words, Bengali terms, particularly exclamation, kinship terms, food, flora, fauna, and that I thought, and at least I've been told by the reviewers, that it kind of worked.
Thanks, Aruna. Let me come back to you on that. I'm going to move to Vishesh. Vishesh, translating, so Vijay Dandetha, you are looking more or less at a contemporary period. I mean, he died, what, 20 years ago? Yeah? Yeah, and, but still, it's not so distant. But what were for you the excitements and the challenges, and why did you start doing it?
Hello. I think for me, translation is an act of activism in some way, and this is not what I realized when I was setting out to do it. I realized it in hindsight. I translate from my mother tongue into English. My mother tongue, Rajasthani or Marwari, as it is more colloquially known, is not a recognized language by the constitution. And even speakers of the language will sometimes ask, कि इसको लिखते कैसे? इसको क्या हिंदी में ही लिखते हैं? Which is an ironic question because the written history of the language predates Hindi by at least 400 or 500 years. So it's the irony and you know, the comical nature of that question never escaped me. So I think for me, translation became a means of creating awareness that yes, इसको लिखते ऐसे हैं और इसमें बहुत साहित्य है. So it became a way of self-assertion. And it became a way of contributing perhaps to the archive of the language which was available to readers in English. The immediate trigger came while I was teaching at Ashoka University, where there was a course, as you said, on gender and sexuality, which was being taught in the English department. And there was one of the stories, Bija and Tija, from Ruth Vanita's collection, which was being taught. And I had no idea that Vijayan Detha was of any interest to people outside 200 kilometers of Jodhpur, because that was my idea of, Vijayan Detha as being a local icon who had collected a huge archive of folk stories. So when I saw that it was of interest, I had some colleagues who encouraged me to make some samples. And from then and there on, as it is the case with many of us, it was the case of being in the right time at the right place. The market for translations had just opened up back in 2017, 2018. Publishers want to expand their Indian languages lists. And there was luckily no one else who was translating from Rajasthani into English. So it all sort of just fell into place thereafter. For me, the main challenge, as you put it, so I mean, other than the usual challenges which would come in translating from any one language and culture into the other, there was the additional challenge that Detha was mainly, so his modus was that he would go around, or he would pay the daily wage workers in his village, he would pay them a daily wage to come and sit with him and tell him stories. And as is the case with human memory, as you begin to exercise it regularly, you can really go very far back, with habit and practice. So the women were able to tap back into stories which they had heard as children, or they had heard from an aunt who had in turn come from another place. So you're talking of hundreds of kilometers worth of stories and hundreds of years worth of stories that are suddenly being collected and funneled into one place and time. And he collects and begins to use these story lines almost, but recasts them into the form of a modern short story. And that's where, Detha's own touch of being a modern, liberal, his feminist ideologies, his socialist ideologies come into play, because they're always told from the point of view of the woman, or from the point of view of the farmer, and never from the point of view of the thakur, or the landlord, or the banya, or the priest, which would have usually been the case in these stories. Detha's style is very oral, and I think that was his biggest victory, that he took an oral medium, and he retained that orality in his text. And it was very difficult for me personally to be able to retain that orality in English, while at the same time also giving some sense of locality as well into the language. Because Detha is writing in Rajasthani for a Rajasthani audience, for people who are familiar with the context. So the motifs, the festivals, the rituals, they're all very familiar to people. But here I am writing for an Indian reader, perhaps an Indian urban reader reading in English. So the regionality and the orality, retaining both of those were, I think, very, I found it very tricky. I think it's for the readers to decide if one has succeeded or not. But I used certain techniques, and I'm sure they will find modification as I progress on to further work.
There are two things you said which actually link up with Arshia's work, so I want to come to that. One is, you spoke of translating from a language that is not recognized in the so-called schedule of languages, and what it is like to translate from that and push your work into a readership which isn't yet at that time, even though publishers were interested in translation, isn't yet that hospitable to translations, which is used to reading a certain kind of thing, which is what gets visibility. So even though Vijayan Detha himself was quite well known, but how to get that out there? And the second thing that you said towards the end of what you were saying was how to render the oral into the written, because once it is written, then there's a fixity to it. But to my mind, the activism of translation, which you see very much in the multiple translations of the Ramayana. I mean, you don't only see activism, you see a lot else. But just that you can come back to the same text, time after time, century after century, and the current social and political context of that time provides you a new entry into it. Recently, for example, Arshia, I think you probably know this, Meena Kandaswamy has translated the Book of Desire, Thiruvallar's Book of Desire, and she calls it the first feminist translation, where she rejects the looking on of the lovers from the lens of morality and looks at it from the lens of desire. So for you, when did you come? Because I know you did the Ramayana at a very young age. You were a child practically. What an ambitious undertaking to do.
Thanks, Urvashi.
You can't be heard.
Oh, I can't be heard.
No.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, child, I was in my mid-30s, but
You
in
have to
terms
hold
of,
it close to you.
Sorry.
Hold it closer.
Okay. I was a child when I did Ramayana. I was in my mid-30s, but in terms of Ramayana, that is being a child. And I think I was able to do it because I didn't think it through. If I had understood the enormity of what I was planning to do, I wouldn't have done it. So there's great courage in ignorance. And I think I coasted on that. I want to also address Meena Kandaswamy's thing. There's a lot going on now. First feminist translation of the Iliad, first feminist translation of the Odyssey. Emily Wilson, Meena Kandaswamy is making that claim as well. What I think is much more important than it being feminist is it's the first time it's been translated by a woman, and to my mind that automatically makes it feminist. Because you treat language differently. Emily Wilson says that, in the Iliad and the Odyssey, she's taken out all the words for whore and slut and prostitute and all of that. And I'm like, that's really too bad that you took them out, because we have to know where the patriarchy comes from. We have to know where the patriarchy is located, and we have to acknowledge that the patriarchy is as old, as Sam Miller was saying, as human migration. It's what we do. This is how we structure our societies. So I have at the same time, I completely agree with Vishesh that translation itself is activism. Yeah, because you are bringing to a place, a language, a culture, a time, something that is new, something that is different, something that is potentially revolutionary. Yeah? And of course that, as you said, at this moment it's ridiculous. Every single translation of the Ramayana is subversive because of the way we're treating Ramayana now. And until 30 years ago, it was the seminal text of the culture, even more than Mahabharata was. And now suddenly, wow, you translate Ramayana, it must be wrong. And it's like, no, actually, it's not. All Ramayanas are correct. All Ramayanas say, as you said, what they need to say in that time and in that place. And every translator also says what she or they need to say in that time and place. Yeah.
So are you saying that bringing feminism to translation, or when a woman translates a text that has been translated many times before by man, she brings something to it, but you're saying also that to wipe out things like whore, slut, etc. from the text is wiping out the patriarchy? Is that what you're saying? And therefore we need a record of that. Yeah?
I am saying that because it's very easy to elide, right? See, this is why we have introductions to translations. So the translator can say, look everybody, this is what I'm doing, right? And that becomes your politics. That also becomes your activism. But yeah, I think it's important not to airbrush translations in the light of our 21st century politics. I have the same problem with many people want to change the gender nouns in classical texts, and that makes me a little bit uncomfortable, because it is a masculinist world. These texts are written for men. You can't say she. It's not going to make any sense, because we also imagine that, classics especially are ahistorical. No, they're not. They're completely historical. They are written at a particular historical moment, and this is the way the world was, and we need to know that, and we need to remember it.
Yeah, your people are not hearing you. Yeah.
But I'm done.
So what Arshia was saying, in case you didn't hear it, that we make a mistake in imagining that classics are ahistorical. They are completely historical. They are written at a particular moment, and they are of that moment, and will reflect the politics, I guess, of that moment, interpreting what you're saying. So let me just enter this, and any of you can come in and respond. Just very quickly, so there's this Japanese classic called The Tale of the Genji, 11th century classic, which centers around the incident of the sexual violation of her. I think she's 14 years old or 12 years old. And the ways in which it has been translated over the years, and the feminists have raised a lot of questions about how the men who have translated this work have not seen that act as anything other than either a simple within quote seduction, or an act of appropriating what belongs to the man, this child, who is actually the lover of her stepmother and who has a son from the stepmother, and then takes this child away and at some stage rapes her. And that is a product of the morality of the times. So I think this issue is actually quite complicated. But let me not go there. I want to add to this a little bit as a publisher. So I'm a publisher, and we focus a lot on translations. And as Vishesh said, for us, translation too is an act of activism. It is also responsibility to actually create and reflect a universe that is bibliodiverse, that brings in all kinds of voices, and that doesn't only focus on one language, one culture, etc. And therefore, we who publish in English, it's our responsibility, I think, to publish translations from Indian languages into English and the other way around. But it's a very difficult thing for many reasons, and I'll mention only a few of them. One of them is access to the texts. How do you get to know which text to translate if you don't know the language? And you're often very dependent on friends and others who might tell you, or you end up repeating the power game and picking up the best known texts, which you may not necessarily want to do. Second, translation is actually a very expensive enterprise. So for publishers who are strapped for cash, especially independent publishers, how do you pay translators for the work they've done? Because it's a huge bit of work. And if you can't pay them, you're contributing to the inferiorizing of translation and seeing it as something, as a lesser act than the actual writing of the book, where it often isn't, because it takes the book into a completely different culture and marketplace. Third, when you put translations out into the market, you are trying to put into the market work that is not known, not recognized, and often, as Vishesh will tell you, and I'll leave him to tell you that story, that when you might be submitting translations for an award, there are so many restrictions on what can qualify, which don't, those same restrictions don't apply for books in English. So that's another aspect of publishing translations that makes it very, very difficult. And then how do you commission a translator? So right now I'm working on a book of stories which have been translated, I won't say from what language. And the translator whose work we saw in a sample, and it was good, has actually given all the stories the same voice. And they are by like 17 or 18 different writers, and they all sound the same. And what do you do in that kind of instance? It's a very, very difficult decision to take. And finally, I'm not sure that many of us are aware of this. Part of the reason why translation is seen as something lesser in the pecking order than writing is that in the early days, at least in the world of English writing, women were not accepted as writers. They had to take male names like George Eliot, George Sand, various others to be able to write and to be accepted. And therefore, many times they turned to the act of translation. And some of the early books are translated by women, and that is also why translation comes to be seen as something inferior. So from the publisher's point of view, I thought these might be interesting insights on translation. Any of you want to come back on any of those? And this is an adda, so I'm not going to ask you a question, but...
You know, I think, I mean, one of the first things, I'm speaking from my own experience, that when I translated that first poem, first lyric, actually it's a song by Tagore, I got a feeling that I was actually creating something. I didn't get the feeling that I was translating. That yes, I had a text in front of me, but I didn't at all, I mean, the joy of creativity was there. And I realized that translation is really not an inferior skill. It is as, maybe not as, not on the same level as creative writing, but it's very close to creative writing. And I also think that the translator, a good translator, should also be a creative writer, not in the sense that she may or she may not actually do creative writing, but should have a creative impulse, within her. And when you were saying about, you were talking about the, how you were talking about how males translate or males write. Sometimes it is really necessary. Like I had this experience when I was doing Srikantu. Now, Sharat Chandra had a very peculiar, very ambiguous, a way of writing. He was, in this book at least, he was what people say, he was a Nari, he used to write about women, and he was really involved and interested, and he propagated the women's issues. And yet in this book, there are many, many instances of the way men subjugate women, images of the woman kneeling at the feet of the male, wiping his feet, serving him, fanning him. Now, all that is there, and yet one knows that Sharat Chandra is not really, he doesn't belong to that class. He has a different vision of women. So it was a bit difficult for me. Like, I didn't know what exactly to do. And I found myself highlighting certain portions and sort of, giving a slightly lesser importance to all this nonsense, all this. Yeah. So, and in fact, a few people have even criticized me that this is not translation. Translation should actually be word for word, image for image, thought for thought. But I don't agree. I don't agree. I feel that in my translation, the real Sharat Chandra is there, not the mixed, the unsure one.
Arshia, you look like you want to say something. You're nodding vigorously. Come on, say it.
No, this is what I meant.
Hold the mic close.
Sorry. That women read texts differently because we would notice something like this perhaps more quickly or than a male reader would. We would want to do something about this troublesome passage, right? So as you say, I agree that as a translator you can't throw things out. You can't excise things because it's in the text, and really it's not about you, it's about the text, right? So depends what you want to do. If you want to show, in certain parts of Ramayana and Mahabharata, it's very difficult to get away from the kind of violence that is that women are subject to, whether it's Shurpanakha or Draupadi or Sita's exile. Now, reading it as a woman, you think about, okay, now, how much attention do I want to draw to this, right? And depending on the kind of attention you want to draw to it, your language changes, because there's no such, there's no equivalent that one word means one thing.
One doesn't actually dismiss anything or, throw out anything. One dilutes. And one has to dilute very discreetly so that,
people don't
get to know.
So it's an act of deception, you're saying.
In a sense,
Vishesh, you were saying activism. Look at what these women are saying. What do you think?
I'm not going to be drawn into this conversation because I'm the one man sitting between three people who are talking about feminism in translation. I'm not going to go into this territory, but I have something interesting to share, which is, two things, two troubles which I kept running into. But the first book was with Puffin Classics, which is a children's imprint of Penguin Random House. And nominally, these stories are perhaps told to children, right? They are folk stories meant to be told to children. And I've spoken about this a couple of the other times. I've had the chance to speak publicly that my publisher, and particularly the editor, really got into a huff about many of the stories. And they were like, if you put these stories in, it will be the end of this book, because we will not get prescribed by any school. And no school teacher or library will admit it into the children's section. And that's where Puffin classics are usually sold. And one of the reasons was a set of stories which is about a very popular female vamp figure called the Dakan, who keeps coming and eats children and this, that and the other. And this witch type of figure is usually lives at the edge of the village, and she uses curse and cuss words in free flow, and she usually gets drunk by night just before she wants to have a party and find a child to cook for that night. And my publisher really found it very difficult to fathom, that she's getting drunk, and I'm trying to use words like booze in the text, because that's what I would imagine she would call it. She wouldn't call it like wine or whatever. So my publisher really got into a huff, and there were other stories which were very clear sexual allegories in the stories, and so this was an idea that I struggled quite a bit with for quite some time before I finally had to have this conversation, and I realized that we say these stories are stories for children, but our idea of what constitutes childhood today is very different from what it might have constituted 100 years back. And if it's being told to a 12 or 13-year-old child, I mean, she or he might be a child, but they're going to be married within a year and producing children the next year. So perhaps these stories were essential sex education transfer tools from one generation to the other. I think we had to take it up on a case-by-case basis with the publisher, but some of this dilution that you're talking about, I think it did happen, which was what prompted me to move the second book into a full-fledged adult imprint, so that I could be freer with the flow of words and ideas and all kinds of raucousness that was happening in these stories. And these stories are actually very dark. I mean, children's stories, they love killing characters off, and everyone dies in most of them by the time they're over. And the other thing which was a bit of a struggle was, Detha is really trying, I think he's very aware of what's happening in the world, right? He regards Anton Chekhov and Tolstoy and Sharat Chandra Chatterjee as his three gurus for short story writing. And he's, in his letters, I found letters to Mahashweta Devi, he's communicating with Satyajit Ray, he's communicating with the Sahitya Akademi. So he's very aware of this entire progressive writers movement which is happening. And you can see he keeps on trying to even assert himself as saying that, my stories are more original than the originals themselves. But at the same time, in the stories, there's this one story where there's a war between a kingdom of crows and a kingdom of swans. And obviously, it's the kingdom of crows who are the evil ones, right? And, it's the kingdom of swans who are the virtuous ones and pure ones. And you understand what is the racist subtext, this undertone which is going on. And there's mention of dowry, or there's mention of, there's all kinds of problematic aspects that are going on. It was very, as you struggled, what does one do with these stories? I mean, it's still a great story. It makes for a great tale. There's a lot more happening within the story. And, suddenly the crows fly to Mansarovar, and then they come back with the swans, and the swans get cheated in the desert, and then there's a wife who has a pregnancy in the middle. And so, everything happens. There's every element of a historical drama, perfect for a Netflix adaptation, a la Game of Thrones that we can think of, is happening in the story. So, I think, and that's what I use the translator's note for, to say that I'm alive to these ideas, but it is not my place to decide which of these ideas comes to you and which of them doesn't. You're a discerning reader, and you'll be able to read it appropriately. The second issue which I perhaps specifically encountered, which perhaps the other two translators with me might not have encountered, which is that when we translate into English in the shadow of such a powerful language like Hindi, that the editors and proofreaders constantly will want to use Hindi as a point of intermediation, and they'll pretend that your language is just similar to Hindi or any version of Hindi which they have heard characters from Rajasthan speak in movies or in a TV serial or something like that. And a book will keep coming back to you with edits. कि आप इसको हेली नहीं हवेली कीजिए, इसको आप इंद्र नहीं इंद्र कीजिए, इंद्र भगवान लिखिए, आप इंद्र भगवान मत लिखिए, या these kind of issues where you're using original words, purportedly original words in the English text, but you keep on Sanskritizing them because that's what we imagine as more legitimate or acceptable or correct. So it's the tatsam roops of all the words, and the deshaj words get left out, and that was quite a battle for me to fight with the publishers to insist that I'm translating from a language and a culture which is distinct from what you may think of Hindi as. And therefore, it is very important that my translation is a translation from Rajasthani into English, and it must reflect as that and not using the bridge language of Hindi in the middle.
Yeah, thanks for saying that, because I know Arshia is dying to respond to you. Just that now you pointed to another very interesting aspect, which is not only is it activism, but it's also a battle and a process of negotiation between the translator and the publisher also, which is quite interesting, because now I can reflect on my own practice towards the translators in that. So now we have 15 minutes left, and we want to keep some time for questions. So Arshia, if you respond to that, and if any of you would like to comment very briefly, if you have time, if not, I'll stop you, on the afterlife of translations. You know, when you're done with the translation, does it go into the void and you never think of it again, or do you wake up dreaming, thinking, oh my God, I did that wrong, I should have done it this way?
So I also have a publisher story. So I've been...
Good thing I'm not your publisher.
But it's good. It's an interesting story. So I'm retelling the stories of the great Sanskrit plays for younger readers. You know, like Charles and Mary Lamb. So many of us encountered Shakespeare first through Charles and Mary Lamb retellings. So anyway, I sent it off to my publisher, just, you know, drafts of the first three things. This is what it's looking like. And she writes back and she says, oh my God, this is so not for children. I said, oh, I'm so sorry, is the language a bit complex? I can simplify the language. She said, no. In these Sanskrit plays, everybody is having affairs. Everybody is sleeping with people outside their marriage. The queens are so bad-tempered. They're always locking up the women who their men have. So I said, yeah, man, now what to do? These are the stories. And she said, I said, why do you think they're not for children? She said, children are so moralistic these days. You know, that, and she also said, I'm not sure that parents will buy these stories for their children. So, yeah.
They won't. That's the short and long of it. Okay, so unless any of you has anything you crucially want to add, we can open it up to questions with a little extra time. Anyone got a question? Otherwise, can I ask you to keep it short, the question? Yeah, when you get a mic, yeah.
So I've been hearing a lot about what you said, Vishesh, about, you know, doing things that children would like to be able to read, and you spoke about, you know, not being able to actually say what is in the original text. And I was thinking about Sir Richard Burton translating, you know, the Arabian Nights. And then I have read those same when I was a child. And they were absolutely accurate, but they were not the same thing. The original translation of Sir Richard Burton borders on pornography. So my question to you is, and please, I don't mean it you personally, I mean, you know, the translators of this world. Is it our weakness that we are unable to bring truth to children rather than anything else, and our prudishness that actually prevents accuracy in our translations?
Yeah, go ahead.
I can answer on my behalf. I don't know about the translators of the world. But my experience has been that I don't mind this sanitization conversation that much anymore. Particularly when I've gone deeper and deeper into folklore, I realize that in each age people have told the stories as they have seen fit. And Detha has also done the same, right? He's responding to global ideas that are prevalent at that point of time. In fact, the story Bija and Tija, which you say is very popular, particularly once it found its way into Ruth Vanita and Salim Kidwai's book. When I was in Borunda, I was told by members of his family that it was he had first heard it in the sermon of a Jain monk who had come wandering into the village, and in the daily sermon there was this story that was narrated. I found the same story in a 19th century archive. The first story itself is, I mean, not same, but very similar motif, where there's a girl who's brought up as a boy because the king has not had a male heir. So he brings up his daughter as a boy, and then of course the boy has to be married off to another woman when he comes of age, and then the two women still decide to live happily ever after. Of course, the realization that both of us are women living together is not that stark or in your face, because it's told from a different point of view. You know, the Jain monks are telling it from the point of view of, this is how usne apne sheel vrat ko nibhaya, usne apne sat ko nibhaya, that, you know, whatever fate has given to me, I have borne it with, steadfastly borne it. So everyone is picking up these same stories, and, you know, the same story also finds its way into one of the khyats of the region. You know, the idea of a parrot, where there's a magician who puts his life into a parrot. It finds its way into the Arabian stories. So it's these motifs which are traveling, and everyone is picking up these motifs to serve their own purpose. You know, there will be royal treatises where these motifs, you will see, they will enhance the legitimacy of the state. They will put in religious figures because they then want to, you know, curry favor with, for example, the merchant community, which is dominant in that region at that point of time. Or they will commission a temple, and that's what we call as syncretic today, that, oh, look, there was a Nawab who then patronized a temple. But, you know, it's all the real politic of everyday life that is happening. So I don't find any great single truth that I must communicate. I think Detha took liberties with the truth, and it's fine if we also then take liberties somewhat with Detha's truths, whatever is admissible, so that, you know, we can still call it a translation of Detha, and not then, you know, not my retelling of the story.
I think what you're saying, and the question that you're raising really is that there is no such thing as a pure translation, right? Translation is located, as Arshia said, writing is located in a time and space and a politics and a social and cultural environment. Over a period of time that changes, and that translation itself will adapt and change to that. And there is a, you know, I don't know if you've seen Ranjit Hoskote's translation of Lal Ded, the Kashmiri woman poet, where Hoskote takes the point of view that Lal Ded is no longer a singular author, but over the centuries, she has accreted, her work has accreted and accumulated the tellings and the use that she has in Kashmiri society, both Hindu and Muslim. And therefore, what is now presented is not an Ur text, but a text that survives today, which may be quite distant from the original. So in a sense, there is an adaptability, there is an evolution in translations, and I think that's why translation and retranslation over time maps that evolution. It can be quite interesting. Aruna, you want to respond to something, or should we take another question?
No, I just wanted to say that, see, every form of art evolves. Translation also evolves. And I may say something that is very controversial. I think a translation is not only about the author, it's also about the translator. Something of the translator also passes on to the work. So it's really because, you know, there's no such thing as the ultimate truth or the ultimate, you know. I mean, even truth is multiple. You may read a book in a certain way. I may read a book in a different way. So when we translate, maybe our translation will have different...
Okay, we can take two more questions. One, and is there another one anywhere? No, just, there is? Okay, so let's take both of those, and then whoever wishes can answer. Please.
I have a question for Aruna Chakravarti, which you kind of partially answered in your last comment, which is, when you're translating something like Tagore's songs, which have been influentially translated by so many people, William Radiche, Shankho Ghosh, Shukanta Chaudhary, are you distracted at any point when you're stuck? I mean, maybe the equivalent of something like translator's block with an idea, the presence of other competing translations, some of which are, you know, have become canonical in their own right.
Aruna, don't answer that. Let's take the second question, and then, if you don't mind. Yeah.
Adab. So while you are translating, at times it happens from the original language to English, just say Urdu, Sanskrit, Hindi. So there are certain phrases that does not have an English word for it. Then what do? Do you overlook those words? Do you find another meaning? I mean, how do you go about that?
Okay, now
Well,
anyone
I'd like to take this because, in a sense, both the questions are are connected. One does get stuck, very badly stuck, and very often, like I'll give you an example. In one, particularly when I was doing Tagore's lyrics, and these are not only poetry, but they are also compositions. So basically, you not only have to translate, I mean, the words, of course, you have to translate, but you have to translate something of the swing, the rhyme, the cadence. I mean, of course, you can't put it in rhythm because that becomes very difficult. But something even hinting at the primary tune, because Bengalis are very familiar with Tagore songs, and if there's a slightly jarring note, they'll pick on it. So one gets stuck a number of times. For instance, I'll just give you an example. There's this song, Shudhu Jawa Asha, Shudhu Srote Bhasha, Shudhu Alo Andhare, Kada Hasha. So I thought that, I have to put it in a certain, I have to give the same kind of a feel about the song, and even the same kind of tune. Somewhere the tune also must be there. So I translated it as only to come and go, drift gently with the tide, only to laugh and weep in a world of dark and light. So this shudhu, 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 that kept coming. Then one time when I got really stuck was with a song, Asha Jawar Pother Dhare, In that song, there is one word. In fact, that's the last word of the song. The word is Udashin. Now, Udashin, we use the word Udashin very commonly in Bengali, and we use it as someone who's indifferent, callous, even self-centered, and that kind of. But I knew that obviously Rabindranath didn't mean that. And I did the entire song. It's a beautiful song. I did the entire song, was very, very happy with it, and then I just didn't know what to do with Udashin. I just racked my brains for days on end, and then I abandoned. I said, well, this song will have to be cut out of the anthology because I can't do it. And the more I thought about it, I saw the scene. Because it's কোন চৈত্র মাসে বকুল ঢাকা বনের ঘাসে মনের কথার টুকরো আমার কুড়িয়ে পাবে কোন উদাসীন. This image was so beautiful and so clear. It just was in my mind. This spring in Bengal, trees, grass wet with dew, and bokul dhaka, so flowers falling. I could see all that, but I just couldn't find where the udashin could come in. And then it kept on. Even after I abandoned the poem, even then I kept on, it kept haunting me. And suddenly I got the answer in a very strange kind of a way. I actually saw it. I had a vision of a bowl, walking along a red, in whom
I'm
the...
going to ask you to wrap up quickly because I want to give them a minute each.
Yeah. So I saw this, I saw a bowl sort of with an ektara, and he just stooped and picked up something. So I translated the last line as, and in fragrant March, when the grass in the wood is covered with bokul flowers, a wandering minstrel perhaps may find the remnant of a word. And that I thought I was very happy with, and my reviewers were also very happy with.
Great, thank you. Does either of you have anything to add? We have 2 minutes and 14 seconds. Go, पहले आप करने में time नहीं लगाइए, बोलिए.
What I find untranslatable or very difficult to translate in my case, particularly because these are folk stories, is so an example. There was a line which says that there was a kumbhar, a potter, who had 2 daughters. One was married into a kumbhar family which made pots for a living, and another was married into a kumbhar family which tilled the land for a living. And if you translate it into English, it becomes like a potter who had 2 daughters, one married into a potter family who made pots for a living, and the other married into a potter family who tilled the land for a living. And it doesn't make any sense because we think of potter as occupation. And then the realization was that, for us, Kumbhar is actually caste. It's not just occupation. So you can be a Kumbhar, but you could be a teacher in a school, but you still remain a Kumar 7 generations after your family stopped making pots for a living. These social realities and social power dynamics, which are so connected to caste, if you translate them into equivalent words, I found them very, very difficult to translate. So I've stuck with using most of the addresses, caste names, caste designations, honorifics. I've stuck with using all of them because they're very loaded in cultural and social realities.
Yeah. Arshia?
I'll answer both questions, actually. I think that when we come to this point of like, how do we communicate the truth to children, or how do we come to a phrase that, like the one that you were struggling with, I think this is actually the most exciting moment for a translator, because you are forced to stretch the language into which you are translating. You're forced to look for words that are already in your head. You're forced to go to a thesaurus. You're forced to talk to your friends. But in both cases, you can't say, I'm not going to try. You may not succeed very well, but that is the crucible, really, of translation, when it doesn't come easily, so.
And that's the eureka moment, That's the moment you feel, I've got it.
Yeah, it's a good moment to end on, and I will direct your attention to other eureka moments that appear in translations of subtitles in films which are getting more and more sophisticated. And for those of you who have seen Pathan, and at the end of it, when Shah Rukh Khan falls on some big thing and then gets up and holds his back and says, oh, lower back. I thought that was a really masterful translation, which is what is happening to us. So we should all get off the stage now. Thank you very much for listening. Thank you, all of you.